Almost everyone already carries a version of Marie Antoinette somewhere in their mind. The towering powdered hair, the silks, the rumoured cake, the narrow edge of the blade at the end. She has stood as a symbol for so long, and symbols are heavy things. They settle over a person like snow over a garden, softening every shape until you can no longer tell what was growing underneath. So tonight we brush the snow away, slowly, and go back to the beginning. To a girl born into one of the most powerful families in Europe, handed a role she never asked for, set down in the middle of a storm that had been gathering long before she arrived to stand in it. There is no hurry in any of this. Let your shoulders come down from where they have been sitting all day. Adjust your pillow if it needs adjusting. Somewhere tonight, someone in Melbourne is listening at 2 a.m, and someone in Toronto just past midnight. All of you settling into the same story at once, in the dark. Her story does not start in France at all. It starts in Vienna, inside one of the most formidable dynasties the continent had produced, in a household that ran on ceremony, expectation, and the calm and constant use of its own children as instruments of foreign policy. In the middle of the 18th century, the Habsburg Empire was one of the great powers of Europe, sprawling across the centre of the continent, gathering Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, and a dozen other territories beneath a single crown. And at that moment, it was ruled by a woman. Maria Theresa held Austria as archduchess, and Hungary and Bohemia as queen in her own right, unusual enough that several neighbours had spent the first years of her reign trying to take it from her. They did not succeed. She was formidable in a way almost nobody had predicted, and she governed her court, her ministers and her children with the same demanding energy, an energy that left very little room for sentiment. The family had a saying about itself, older than she was, half boast and half instruction. Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. Land taken by armies could be lost to armies. Land taken by a wedding tended to stay. On the 2nd of November, 1755, in the east wing of Schönbrunn Palace, Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna was born. She was the 15th of 16 children, which, in the ordinary arithmetic of dynastic life, meant she was not especially important. The nurseries were full, the succession well covered. She was one small child in a very large family, and for the first several years she was allowed to simply be that. Running in wide gardens, surrounded by siblings, untouched by the machinery humming away in the rooms above her. There is a story from those rooms that Vienna has never quite let go of. In the autumn of 1762, a boy of 6 named Mozart was brought to Schönbrunn to play for the Empress. He played beautifully. Afterward, so the tale goes, he crossed the polished floor too quickly, slipped, and was helped up by one of the small archduchesses. Historians still debate whether it happened at all, or whether the scene was assembled later by people who found it too perfect to leave alone. 2 children on a waxed floor in a golden room, neither knowing anything of what was coming. By every account that survives, Maria Antonia was a cheerful girl, quick to smile, easy in company, fond of music, and uninterested in sitting still long enough to learn anything difficult. Her education, to put it kindly, was not her finest achievement. By 10, she could not write properly in French or German. Her spelling wandered. Her handwriting left her tutors in quiet despair. She had real talent at the harpsichord, a natural gift for dancing, and an instinctive warmth that made her likeable within moments. But in anything that had to be studied rather than felt, she was far behind where her mother expected her to be. Maria Theresa noticed. Maria Theresa noticed everything. The Empress was not a soft mother. Her love for her children appears entirely real, and it existed alongside a perfect clarity about what they were for. Marriages were alliances, children were assets, affection was permitted, but never allowed to interfere with the larger arithmetic of power. This was not cruelty. It was the Habsburg method, practiced across generations with the calm efficiency of a long-running enterprise. She wrote her children long letters all their lives, in which maternal worry and political instruction were braided so tightly that no one has ever managed to separate them. In August of 1765, her father died. Emperor Francis I was gone, and Maria Antonia was 9 years old. The loss settled over the household and never entirely lifted. Maria Theresa put on mourning black and wore it for the rest of her life, and threw herself harder into the work of ruling. The court grew quieter. A low, steady grief became part of its permanent weather, and the children grew up inside it the way you grow up inside a climate, unremarked and always there. Across the continent, France was ruled by Louis XV, aging, politically weakened, presiding over a kingdom quietly accumulating problems it had no appetite to face. The 7 Years' War had ended in 1763, badly and expensively. The treasury was strained. The alliance between France and Austria, formalized in 1756 in what historians would later call the diplomatic revolution, mattered a great deal to both crowns and had never felt natural to either. Alliances like that require maintenance, and the most reliable form of maintenance was a marriage. France had a young heir, Louis Auguste, Duke of Berry, grandson of the king. Quiet, reportedly awkward, not especially commanding in a room, but heir to the throne all the same. Austria had a daughter of the right age. The daughter was Marie Antoinette. She was 11 when the discussions turned serious, and no one consulted her. This was not an oversight. It was how the world worked at that height, where nations secured their futures through the marriages of children, wrapped the arrangement in ceremony and silk, and called it statecraft. Once the decision existed, the whole household turned toward it. French tutors began arriving at Schönbrunn with new purpose. Etiquette lessons lengthened. Dancing, deportment, posture, language, the correct depth of a curtsy. Everything accelerated, because the timeline had stopped being theoretical. A girl was going to France, and she needed to arrive in a condition France could receive without embarrassment. The warmth was still there. So was the restlessness. But both were being quietly shaped now, aimed at a single destination, moulded into something resembling a queen before she had been given the chance to become a person. The child in the gardens, the one who disliked her lessons and loved to dance, was not disappearing. She was being reorganized, patiently and systematically, by forces that had settled her future long before she was old enough to have an opinion about it. To understand what her mother was arranging for her, it helps to look at what she had already arranged for everyone else. By the time the French negotiations turned serious, Maria Theresa had distributed her family across the map of Europe with the precision of a woman playing a very long game. Her eldest daughter, Maria Anna, sent to govern the Austrian Netherlands. Her son Leopold installed in Tuscany. Maria Carolina destined for Naples. Maria Amalia sent to Parma. The Habsburg children were not simply a family, they were a network, each one set carefully into place, each one a node in an enormous web of alliances stretched across the continent. France was the most important node of all. The alliance signed in 1756 had overturned more than 2 centuries of hostility. For most of European history, France and the Habsburgs had been natural enemies, quarrelling over territory, assembling opposing coalitions with dependable regularity. When the 2 crowns suddenly stood on the same side, the diplomatic world was stunned. It was the kind of realignment that happens once in a lifetime, and Maria Theresa understood how fragile it was. Alliances written on paper can be unwritten. Alliances sealed through a marriage are far harder to undo. The heir waiting at the other end had not always been Louis Auguste. Earlier plans had involved other children, other pairings, but the succession at Versailles kept turning in directions nobody had chosen. The king's son, the Dauphin Louis Ferdinand, died in 1765. His eldest boy followed him into an early grave not long after. And so, by the late 1760s, the future of France rested on Louis Auguste, Duke of Berry. Quiet, heavy-set, happier in his workshop taking locks apart and putting them back together than anywhere in the glittering social theatre of Versailles. By no account that survives was he a natural match for a lively, quick-moving girl from Vienna. But he was going to be King of France, and to the people making the arrangement, that was the only qualification that counted. The formal negotiations ran between two experienced men who understood precisely what was at stake: the Duc de Choiseul for France and Chancellor Wenzel Anton von Kaunitz for Austria. The details took a long time: the size of the dowry, the terms by which she would renounce her Habsburg inheritance claims, the household waiting for her in France, the exact protocols for her transformation from Austrian archduchess into French dauphine. None of it was small. It was hammered out across months of correspondence, and the Empress reviewed every line herself. While the diplomats wrote, the work at Schönbrunn continued with mounting urgency. The most important figure in it was the Abbé de Valmont, a French cleric and scholar sent from Versailles specifically to assess and educate the young archduchess. His first report home was honest to the point of discomfort. The girl was charming, he wrote, engaging, quick to laugh, easy to grow fond of. But her attention wandered. Her intellectual formation was unfinished. Her French, though improving, was nowhere near polished. She had, in his careful phrasing, more grace than depth, and a mind that moved from one thing to the next too quickly to sit with anything difficult. What he never quite wrote down, though it lives between the lines of everything he sent, is that he liked her. He stayed in her life for years afterward, which suggests that whatever her limitations on paper, she earned real loyalty from those who spent real time with her. Historians still turn this over, whether his reports were softened by that fondness, or whether the fondness is the most reliable thing in them. The physical preparation was every bit as thorough. A French dentist was brought to Vienna because her teeth, while not seriously troublesome, required attention before she could be presented at Versailles. A specialist in deportment worked on her posture. A French hairdresser was sent to reshape her hairline into something the French court would find fashionable. Her dancing, already her finest skill, was refined further. The way she held her head, the way she entered a room, the precise angle at which she acknowledged people of different rank. Practiced, corrected, practiced again. And meanwhile, her mother was composing something else. A set of written instructions to be carried into the new life like luggage. Guidance on how to manage the French royal family, how to conduct her religious practice, how to behave in public, how to speak of the French people, and how to be spoken of by them. Some of it practical, some of it stern. Underneath it ran a single message, repeated in 100 forms. She was no longer only a daughter. She was a representative of the Habsburg dynasty, and everything she did in France would reflect back on Austria. The Empress was not wrong about that, but the instructions carried a blind spot inside them. All her clear-eyed grasp of diplomacy did not account for how unlike Vienna, Versailles would prove to be, how little real power a dauphine actually held, and how quickly the French court would begin reshaping its newest member in directions no letter from home could anticipate. The betrothal took place in Vienna on the 19th of April, 1770. The Duke of Berry was not there. He was represented by proxy, as royal marriages of the period often were, and the proxy standing in for him was her own brother, Archduke Ferdinand. There is something faintly surreal in it, even by the standards of the age. A girl of 14, pledging herself in marriage to a boy she had never met, with her sibling standing quietly in the stranger's place. The ceremony itself was grand, because Habsburg ceremonies always were. What the room actually felt like, for the Empress watching and for the girl in the white and silver gown, was almost certainly more complicated than the gold and the music suggested. The weeks afterward disappeared into logistics. A trousseau of extraordinary scale had to be assembled. Gowns, linens, jewels, gloves, every accessory a Dauphine might need. None of it could be Austrian. The French court's rule on this was absolute, and it would prove more literal than the young archduchess had understood. The women who had surrounded her since infancy began to be replaced, at first only on paper, by the French household being assembled for her. Piece by piece, the Viennese world was lifted away from around her. Maria Theresa said goodbye to her daughter, knowing, with the clarity practical rulers tend to have about such things, that she would probably never see her again. The distance between Vienna and Versailles was not only a matter of miles. Once she crossed into France, she would belong to France. Her loyalties, her household, her hours, her habits. The letters would continue, and they did for years. But everything between mother and daughter would now travel by courier, across hundreds of miles of rutted road, arriving weeks after the moment that produced it. What the Empress felt about this in private is hard to recover. She was not a woman who committed her interior life to paper. What can be said is that she had done what she believed necessary, and carried out the separation with the same steady will she brought to everything else. The Habsburg method was to arrange the board as carefully as possible, and then release the piece to play its part. The piece, in this instance, was a 14-year-old girl with a gift for dancing, a distaste for study, and a warmth that made people like her within minutes. She was leaving everything she had ever known, travelling toward a country whose language she still spoke imperfectly, to marry a man she had never seen, and to take up a position at one of the most unforgiving courts in the world. The carriages were made ready. The route was fixed, the ceremonies along it arranged in careful sequence. And on the 21st of April 1770, she left Vienna for the last time. The journey to the French border took the better part of 2 weeks. The road ran northwest through Habsburg lands, through towns where people lined the verges to watch a procession of carriages carrying a princess they would never see again. It was slow by necessity. The convoy was enormous. The roads of Central Europe in April were not built for haste, and there were halts for rest, for ceremony, for a timetable planned months in advance. For a girl who had rarely travelled beyond the gardens of Schönbrunn, the view through the carriage window was new in every direction. The towns grew less familiar. The faces at the roadside became strangers. The Viennese accent of her attendants was one of the last sounds tying her to the world behind her. In the first days of May, the convoy reached the Rhine. On the 7th, it stopped at a small island in the middle of the river, a flat and unremarkable stretch of ground near the town of Kehl, across the water from Strasbourg. On any ordinary day, nobody would have looked at it twice. But for the purpose of transferring a Habsburg archduchess to the French crown, it had been chosen as the setting for a ceremony with no real parallel in ordinary life, and considerable effort had gone into preparing it. A pavilion had been built there for the occasion, divided precisely down its middle. One side was Austrian ground, the other was French. The line between them was a strip of decorative material laid across the floor, and though it was entirely symbolic, everyone present treated it with complete seriousness. There is a strange footnote attached to that pavilion. A young law student in Strasbourg named Goethe went to see it beforehand, and found the interior hung with tapestries telling the story of Jason and Medea, a tale of a foreign bride and a marriage ending in catastrophe. He was appalled that anyone had chosen it. He wrote about it decades later, long after the world had given his reaction a terrible weight. Historians still argue how much of that horror was felt at the time, and how much was assembled in hindsight, by a man who knew by then how the story ended. The ceremony was called the remise, the handover. It followed a protocol established for exactly this kind of royal transfer. She entered from the Austrian side, with her Viennese attendants around her. What happened in those rooms was, in practical terms, the complete dismantling of her Austrian self. Every item she wore was taken from her and replaced with a French equivalent. Gown, shoes, stockings, down to the linen. Her jewellery was exchanged. The women who had dressed her since she was small, who had travelled beside her and spoken to her in German, were dismissed on the Austrian half of the room. They could not cross the line. They belonged to the country she was leaving. Neither could her dog. She had a small pug she loved, a flat-faced little animal called Mops, carried somewhere in the travelling arrangements all the way from Vienna. The French household was perfectly clear. The dog was Austrian. The dog would not be coming. Whether the men who drafted that protocol thought this a meaningful detail or simply the logical extension of the rule that governed her stockings, nobody wrote down. But it is the sort of thing that survives in the record precisely because it cuts through the ceremony and lands on something plainly human. On the French side, a new household stood waiting. At its head was the Comtesse de Noailles, appointed chief lady-in-waiting and manager of every hour of her daily life at Versailles. The Comtesse was thorough, correct, and profoundly devoted to French court etiquette in all its layered complexity. In the months ahead, she would acquire a nickname, not entirely affectionate, invented by the girl herself, Madame Etiquette. But that was still ahead. In the pavilion, she was simply France, and France had its own way of doing things. The name changed in that room as well. Maria Antonia became Marie Antoinette. Softer in the vowels, easier on a French tongue, carrying no trace at all of the original. The girl who stepped out onto the French half of that floor was not entirely the same girl who had walked in from the other side. Strasbourg welcomed her with real warmth. The city sat close enough to the German-speaking world that the Habsburg connection felt familiar rather than foreign, and the crowds along its streets were enormous and glad. There was a reception at the cathedral, music, greetings from local dignitaries, all the civic display French authorities had spent weeks assembling. She moved through it with the natural ease that would become one of the most remarked-upon things about her in public. Comfortable with people, quick to smile, and she seemed actually engaged rather than performing engagement, which is rarer in public figures than it sounds. From there the road bent west, deeper into France, toward the royal chateau of Compiègne, where Louis XV had arranged to meet his future granddaughter-in-law. The old king received her on the 14th of May. He was 60, much diminished from the man he had been in earlier decades, but still capable of the practiced charm a lifetime at court produces. His greeting was warm. He approved of her, or said he did, which at Versailles amounted to the same thing. Louis Auguste was there as well. The first time the two of them had ever laid eyes on each other, after years of negotiation and ceremony conducted on their behalf, and almost entirely without them. He was 15, tall for his age, heavy-set, standing through the whole encounter in a visible awkwardness that everyone noticed, and nobody mentioned. He said very little. What he made of the girl from Vienna is not recorded anywhere reliable. He was not, at that stage of his life, a person who committed his inner weather to paper. What is clear is that the meeting was short, formal, and entirely managed by the adults arranged around them. 2 days later, on the 16th of May, 1770, the wedding took place at Versailles. The chapel there, built in the reign of Louis XIV and not remotely modest about it, held the entire weight of the French court that morning. Hundreds of guests. Gowns, jewels, wigs, a level of elaboration at the upper end of even Versailles' range. She wore white, a gown scattered with diamonds and white flowers, its train so heavy that attendants were needed to manage it. Her hair dressed high in the French fashion she was only beginning to realize was not optional. The Archbishop of Reims performed the ceremony. The rings were exchanged. The legal instruments were signed. Louis Auguste's hand on the marriage register was reportedly steady enough. Hers wandered slightly off the line, a small, ordinary human slip in the middle of an enormous occasion. It is still there on the page, if you know where to look. That evening there was a public dinner in the traditional French manner, which meant the couple ate on a raised platform while hundreds of people stood at a respectful distance and watched them lift each fork. Afterward, the newlyweds were escorted to the marriage chamber, with all the ceremony custom demanded. Outside, the fireworks prepared for the occasion never happened. A violent storm came in over the gardens and put an end to them. The next morning, Louis wrote a single word in his diary: nothing. In the French of the time, it recorded that nothing had happened, that there had been no wedding night in any practical sense. Historians have been turning that word over ever since. His diary was largely a hunting log, page after page of dates and totals, and on days when he took nothing, he wrote exactly that word. Some argue it referred only to the hunt. Others note that what followed made the plainer reading hard to dismiss. Either way, whether it was nerves, indifference, or simple uncertainty, the question would occupy the French court, the Austrian embassy, and eventually both of their mothers for years. But none of that was visible on the first morning. The ceremony was complete. The alliance was sealed. A 14-year-old girl from Vienna was now Dauphine of France. Versailles was not simply a palace. By 1770, it had been the centre of French royal life for nearly a century, and in that time it had grown into something closer to a carefully managed theatre than a place where anyone actually lived. Louis XIV had built it that way on purpose. By gathering the nobility inside one enormous building and making attendance at court the price of remaining relevant, he had converted a dangerous aristocracy into an audience. They competed for position, for proximity, for the smallest sign of royal favour, and were far too busy watching one another to organise anything troublesome. The system had worked beautifully for him. 100 years later, it was still running, still elaborate, still in many ways effective. It had also accumulated layer upon layer of ritual, until moving through an ordinary day required something close to specialist training. She had been given a version of that training in Vienna, but no amount of rehearsal in an Austrian palace fully prepares a person for the weight of Versailles at close range. The first thing she would have grasped, within days, is that privacy there was essentially a fiction. The royal family did not live privately, they lived publicly, in front of an audience, according to rituals codified over generations, from which almost no deviation was permitted. The clearest example was the morning ceremony, the lever. Every day the Dauphinée, and later the Queen, rose from bed not alone but in stages, with the court admitted to her bedchamber in a sequence determined by rank. One group entered, then a higher group, then higher still. At each stage some element of the morning was performed in front of whoever had been let in. The washing, the dressing, the arranging of the hair. The right to hand her a particular garment was itself a privilege attached to a specific position. And if a more senior lady arrived while a junior one was already holding it, the garment had to travel back up the hierarchy before it could be offered. There is a well-recorded morning, early in her time there, when the handing over of her shift became so tangled in questions of precedence that she was left standing and shivering while two ladies established which of them outranked the other. The room full of observers watched in silence. The procedure was followed correctly. The garment eventually arrived through the proper channels. She laughed, by one account. A short, slightly helpless laugh. She could see precisely how ridiculous a thing was, and still find herself entirely unable to step outside it. That combination would shape a great deal of what came afterward. The Comtesse de Noailles administered these ceremonies with an intensity that suggested she considered them sacred. To her, the protocols were not arbitrary and not excessive. They were the visible skeleton of an ordered world, the mechanism by which rank was expressed and preserved, the architecture of a society that depended on everyone knowing exactly where they stood. Every deviation, however small, was a crack, and cracks have a way of widening. The Dauphine found her exhausting, which is easy to understand. She found the whole ceremonial apparatus exhausting, in ways she was not entirely free to say aloud. The evening ritual, the coucher, mirrored the morning in reverse. Another audience, another ranked sequence, another careful public performance of something that everywhere else in the world is done alone. Even eating was a performance. The grand couvert, the formal public meal, was held regularly, the royal family seated on a raised platform, while the court, and sometimes members of the ordinary public, stood at a respectful distance and watched them eat. Versailles was, among other things, a destination. People travelled to see it. And the corridors those visitors walked gave off a smell nobody at the time thought remarkable. Candle smoke, crowded bodies, damp stone, and the plain fact that a building housing thousands had never been designed to carry away what thousands of people produce. Gold above, and beneath it, something far less lovely. The social landscape was layered well beyond the formal hierarchy of rank. There were factions, alliances, old rivalries running on their own internal logic, and a newcomer had to map all of it carefully before taking a position on anything. The most immediate complication arrived from two directions at once. On one side stood mesdames, Adelaide, Victoire, and Sophie, the three surviving daughters of Louis XV, who kept apartments at Versailles and exercised a kind of unofficial moral authority simply by being the king's daughters. They held firm views on propriety, on religion, on the correct conduct of a dauphin, and were not shy about sharing them. Their interest in the new arrival was partly maternal and partly strategic. She was young, she could be shaped, and a future Queen of France, oriented in their direction, carried obvious advantages. Historians still disagree about the proportions in that mixture. How much was warmth toward a lonely girl, and how much was calculation? On the other side was Madame du Barry, the king's official mistress, a woman of non-aristocratic origin who had risen to extraordinary influence over an aging monarch, and whose presence at court scandalized everyone who felt it violated the moral order of things. Mesdames despised her. Much of the court regarded her with visible discomfort. But Louis XV was still the king, and her access to him made her genuinely powerful. The Dauphine's position toward her was shaped partly by her mother's instructions, and partly by steady pressure from the Austrian ambassador, Prince Starhemberg, who reported back to Vienna on her conduct at regular intervals. The Empress had been clear. Her daughter was not to openly antagonize the king's mistress. Louis XV's goodwill mattered, and offending him through his companions served no purpose. Mesdames wanted the opposite. They wanted her disapproval demonstrated through the simple and devastating act of never speaking to the woman at all. Caught between them, still finding her footing, she split the difference for a long time by treating Madame du Barry as though she were not quite there, neither embracing her nor publicly cutting her, simply a person the official gaze did not happen to land on. It functioned as a short-term strategy, and it generated its own quiet pressure. In the small, intensely concentrated world of Versailles, the question of whether the Dauphine would ever say a single sentence to the king's mistress became a matter of actual diplomatic consequence. Beyond the political geography, there was the physical one, and the palace was enormous. The Hall of Mirrors alone ran more than 200 feet along the garden front, 17 arched mirrors set opposite 17 arched windows, each throwing the gardens back into the room. Outside, the grounds ran for miles. Fountains, canals, groves, and further out the smaller retreats of the Grand and the Petit Trianon. That second one would matter a great deal later. In those first months, it was another distant building on a property she was still learning to cross. What she discovered early was that Versailles was most bearable outdoors. The gardens offered what the interior could not: informality, air, the ordinary freedom of open space. She walked in them constantly. She rode. She joined the hunts that formed the backbone of the court's outdoor calendar. And she rode well enough that people noticed. It was one of the few activities in that entire world where skill counted for more than rank, where something was actually happening rather than being performed. The performance itself never paused. The audience never entirely went home. And the girl who had arrived in May was slowly, sometimes clumsily, learning what it meant to live inside a court that watched everything and forgot nothing. The young man she had married was, in almost every respect, her opposite. Where she crossed a room easily and drew people toward her without appearing to try, he withdrew. Where she was restless and sociable, he was quiet and happiest in small spaces with a practical task in front of him. He was not unintelligent. He read widely, had a real interest in science and geography, spoke some English, and kept careful records of his days in a diary he maintained with real discipline. He was also, in the particular context of Versailles, almost entirely unsuited to the performance court life demanded. His clearest passion in those early years was hunting. He rode out nearly every day the weather allowed, and came back physically spent and visibly more at ease than he ever managed to look indoors. His second was mechanical work. He had a forge and a set of locksmithing tools installed in a room near his apartments, and he spent long hours there, filing metal, fitting mechanisms, doing the kind of focused labour that leaves something solid in your hand at the end of it. It was the hobby of a craftsman, and it said something honest about the shape of his mind: concrete, patient, far more comfortable with problems that had clear solutions than with the shifting negotiations happening in the rooms below him. Ruling France would not offer many problems with clear solutions. That was a difficulty nobody had noticed yet. For years after the wedding, the marriage remained unconsummated. This was known almost at once by the people whose profession it was to know such things, which at Versailles meant nearly everybody. The morning reports from the royal bedchamber, another ritual that dissolved the line between the private and the institutional, made it perfectly clear. The court observed. The court speculated. And it did so with the concentrated energy that enclosed communities reserve for subjects they are not supposed to mention. The political consequences were not small. A dauphine who was not yet a wife in any practical sense was not producing heirs, and heirs were the entire purpose the marriage had been built to serve. The Franco-Austrian alliance rested on the assumption that this union would produce a successor. Without one, the whole arrangement was ceremony without consequence. In Vienna, the Empress read her reports and grew visibly anxious. Those reports came from Count Florimond de Mercy-Argenteau, an Austrian diplomat of considerable skill and endless patience, who served as Maria Theresa's eyes and ears at Versailles. He wrote about the young Dauphine with a thoroughness that took in her friendships, her spending, her alignments among the factions, and the state of her marriage. His dispatches were detailed, candid, often critical. He was fond of her. His first loyalty was to Vienna, and he never softened an assessment for the Empress's comfort. Her mother's letters arrived more frequently and more directly, concerned, insistent, at times uncomfortably specific. Be more attentive to your husband. Be more careful in your conduct. Keep your attention on the single outcome that matters. Read together now. That correspondence gives a clear picture of the pressure she lived under. Advice travelling hundreds of miles, framed as maternal worry, carrying the full weight of diplomatic necessity inside it. What actually prevented the marriage from being consummated for so long is a question historians have approached from several directions. The explanation most often given is a physical condition on the king's side, some structural difficulty, eventually resolved either by a minor surgical procedure or simply by time, and by the frank advice of his brother-in-law, the Emperor Joseph II, who came to France in 1777 and evidently discussed the matter with remarkable bluntness. The medical particulars are genuinely uncertain, and the accounts written closest to the events are not always the most trustworthy. What nobody disputes is that it lasted 7 years, that it caused real political alarm, and that it left her suspended the entire time, formally a wife and functionally without the standing that a child would have given her. In the meantime, she filled her days with what was available. She drew a circle of younger courtiers around herself, people nearer her own age, easier company than the older factions that had been studying her since her arrival. The Princesse de Lamballe became a close companion, gentle, undemanding, loyal in a way the sharper personalities of the court were not. Later, Gabrielle de Polignac would join that circle and become perhaps the most consequential friendship of her life, though that lay years ahead. Gambling was a permanent fixture at Versailles, and she developed a real appetite for it. Card games running late into the night in private apartments, sums crossing the table that would have been unimaginable to the vast majority of French people, and were regarded inside the palace as an unremarkable feature of an evening. Fashion absorbed her attention, and her accounts in ways already drawing comment within the walls. It would be a mistake, though, to read all of it as simple frivolity. Cards and clothes were also instruments. They cemented relationships. They gave her a position of influence in the absence of any actual power. They let her stand at the centre of a small world she could genuinely govern, since the larger one remained almost entirely beyond her reach. Louis XV died on the 10th of May, 1774. The cause was smallpox, and it moved through Versailles quickly enough that anyone who had never had the disease was advised to leave. Those who stayed with the dying king knew exactly what they risked. He had been ill a fortnight. The last days were not dignified. The court, able to do nothing practical, arranged itself around the vigil with the elaborate formality it brought to everything. A candle had been set burning in a window of his chamber. It had been agreed beforehand that when the king died, the flame would be put out, and the palace would know without a word being spoken. The candle went out. And then came a sound that people who were there never forgot. The whole court turning at once, hundreds of feet moving together through the corridors, a rolling noise like distant thunder, as the entire weight of Versailles rushed toward the apartments of the new king. Inside those apartments, Louis Auguste and Marie Antoinette reportedly fell to their knees together. He said, in one of the very few personal statements from that morning to be reliably preserved, that the two of them felt crushed by what had just descended on them. He was 19. She was 18. Neither had been prepared for this in any substantial way. The years of waiting had been filled with the rituals of court life, rather than the education of people who would one day govern a kingdom. The titles changed instantly. Louis Auguste was now Louis XVI, King of France and Navarre. Marie Antoinette was Queen. The apartments, the ceremonies, the obligations, the watching, all of it expanded to match. The hierarchy reorganized itself around them overnight, the way hierarchies do when a new summit appears. What did not change was the marriage. That remained, for another 3 years, exactly as it had been from the beginning. The new king still rode out to hunt most mornings. The new queen still gathered her companions in the evenings, and Versailles, which had absorbed the deaths of kings and the elevation of successors for nearly a century, carried on with its performance as though this had been one more ceremony in an endless sequence of them. Beyond the gates, though, was a different country. France in the 1770s held roughly 28 million people, and the overwhelming majority of them had never seen Versailles and never would. What the palace represented was one narrow, unusually concentrated version of French life. Extreme, theatrical, and in most respects entirely detached from the conditions ordinary people navigated every day. To understand what was gathering outside those gates, it helps to look at who lived where, and what they wore, and ate, and read. At the top sat the court nobility, families with titles, with apartments at Versailles or great houses in Paris, living inside a luxury managed almost entirely by other people's hands. A noble household of any standing kept dozens of staff. Dressing was a morning event requiring assistance. Meals arrived in many courses on fine porcelain, with silver and wine from the best estates. A courtier's day ran from morning mass to royal ceremonies, to afternoon visits and card tables, to formal dinners and evening entertainments, an existence so completely organized around social performance that almost no private life remained inside it. Which was, most likely, the point. What they wore announced who they were with the precision of a uniform. For noble women through the 1770s, the dominant form was the robe à la française, worn over wide panniers that pushed the skirt out sideways, sometimes several feet on either side. Passing through an ordinary doorway in full court dress required a practiced turn of the hips that every lady learned as a matter of survival. The fabrics were silk and brocade and velvet from the workshops of Lyon, in patterns that changed with the season and were priced accordingly. The jewels were diamonds, pearls, coloured stones in elaborate settings. The value of one well-dressed woman on a formal evening could equal decades of income for a working family. The hair was its own architecture. By the early 70s, the fashionable silhouette demanded height, and what appeared in answer was the pouf. Real hair and false hair, built over wire frames, powdered and decorated, rising 2 feet or more above the scalp, and capable of holding scenes of remarkable specificity. Flowers were ordinary. Small feathers were ordinary. The more ambitious versions carried ships in full sail, pastoral landscapes, bowls of fruit, and in one documented instance, a model of a naval battle. They were so tall that carriage interiors became a genuine problem. Ladies were known to travel kneeling on the floor of the coach, or with their heads out of the window, rather than crush an afternoon's work. And the powder that whitened all of it was made from flour, which meant that the fashionable heads of Versailles were, from a certain angle, wearing food. In a country where bread shortages arrived with grim regularity, that was not a detail people failed to notice. She stood at the centre of it. Her dressmaker was Rose Bertin, a woman of considerable talent and even greater confidence, who ran an establishment in Paris, and who, through the Queen, acquired such influence over French taste that people called her the Minister of Fashion. Her designs were expensive, inventive, and endlessly imitated. Whatever the Queen wore to a public ceremony was discussed, sketched, and reproduced across the country within weeks. Her hairdresser, Léonard Autier, built the constructions above the powder, and he too became a figure of real cultural weight, because whatever the Queen's hair did, the court did afterward. Historians still argue about how to read that spending. One account makes her a spendthrift emptying the treasury into a wardrobe. Another points out that the same appetite kept the silk looms of Lyon running, and that a queen was expected to display magnificence and would have been criticised just as loudly for failing to. A significant step below the nobility came the bourgeoisie, the broad middle class of merchants, lawyers, notaries, doctors, manufacturers and educated professionals, living mostly in the cities and larger towns. They were not poor. A successful Paris lawyer in the 1770s ate well, dressed respectably, educated his children, and kept a household that by any ordinary measure of the time was comfortable. Their clothing was simpler. Panniers were for formal occasions, if at all, and daily dress ran to practical shapes, though the cloth was good, well kept, and worn with the self-possession of a class growing steadily more certain of its own importance. What they read may have been the most consequential thing about them. They read the Encyclopédie, the vast multi-volume project edited by Denis Diderot and Jean-Laurent d'Alembert, which set out to organize and distribute the whole of human knowledge, and, in the process, advanced quiet arguments about reason, liberty, and where authority properly comes from. They read Voltaire, whose sharp wit and contempt for arbitrary power circulated in editions that were officially censored and practically everywhere. They read Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose ideas about natural equality and the social contract handed a philosophical frame to feelings that had been forming without one. The salons of Paris, hosted in private apartments by educated women, where writers and philosophers and clever guests argued through the ideas of the day, were largely bourgeois institutions, and the climate of thought they produced was moving steadily in one direction. Below them were the artisans, the small tradespeople, the urban working poor, the people who made things, carried things, sold things in the markets, and lived in the dense, crowded quarters of Paris and the other great cities. Their lives were built around bread, and the price of bread governed their daily condition more directly than anything else in the world. A good harvest meant bread was affordable and the city stayed calm. A bad harvest meant prices rose, wages did not follow, and the distance between what a family earned and what it cost to feed itself became an immediate crisis. They ate vegetables when they could get them, onions and turnips and cabbage, some dried legumes. Meat was occasional, in the cheaper cuts, on market days. Their clothing was functional, worn until it failed, mended and passed down. Linen next to the skin, wool over it most of the year. Colours undyed, or dyed in the earth tones cheap processes produced. The visual distance between a woman selling in a Paris market and a woman standing in the Hall of Mirrors was so vast that it suggested not merely different circumstances, but different physical realities. Two entirely separate bodies, inhabiting two entirely separate versions of the same country. And the largest group of all was the peasantry, something near 80% of the population, living in conditions that had changed less across the previous century than almost anything else in French life. Families in the countryside grew grain, kept a few animals, worked the land with tools their grandparents had held, and paid, to the crown, to the church as tithe, and onward still. To the local lord as well, in feudal dues that took a meaningful share of whatever the fields produced. A good year left something to live on. A bad year did not. The Enlightenment did not arrive in most peasant villages in any direct form. What arrived was the price of a loaf and the size of the harvest. When those were adequate, political philosophy stayed abstract. When they were not, the abstraction collapsed very quickly into something immediate. All of it was France. The silks and the poufs at Versailles, the arguments in the Paris salons, the queues in the market towns, the households scattered across the countryside. And all of it was connected, as large historical forces always are. The extravagance at the top was visible, and visible things get discussed. The ideas moving through the middle of society were handing people a language for what they saw. The gap between the world inside the palace and the world outside was no longer only a question of wealth. Slowly, and then less slowly, it was becoming a question of legitimacy. The coming queen changed the practical shape of her life. As Dauphine, she had held enormous visibility and very little authority. Watched constantly, required to behave correctly, ultimately secondary to the generation above her. Now there was no generation above her. She was 19, standing at the summit of the most elaborate court in Europe, beside a husband already showing that a crown did not sit comfortably on him. His first months revealed a man who sincerely wanted to govern well and only partly understood how. He was conscientious with his paperwork, read the documents, took the meetings, made real efforts to engage with what was placed in front of him. He was not lazy. He was profoundly uncertain, prone to reversing a decision after making it, reluctant to hold a position under pressure, surrounded by advisors whose interests conflicted with one another, and often with the public good. His instinct when facing a hard choice was to postpone it. In a private man, that is a manageable habit. In a king, it is a serious liability. His coronation took place at the Cathedral of Reims on the 11th of June 1775, following the tradition that had crowned French kings there since the 5th century. The anointing with the sacred oil, kept in a vessel that legend said a dove had carried down from heaven for the baptism of Clovis. The crown of Charlemagne set on his head, the peers of France doing homage in order. Birds released inside the cathedral as a symbol of liberty, wheeling up into the stone vaults while the choir sang. She watched from a gallery, and by several accounts she wept. It was noticed and taken kindly. Afterward she wrote to her mother, describing the moment her husband knelt before the altar and the crowd inside the cathedral cried out unprompted. Whatever France would come to think of these two, in that first summer there was real goodwill, and both of them felt it. There is a shadow across that summer, easy to miss in the accounts of the crowning. Only weeks earlier, grain riots had swept the towns around Paris and reached the gates of Versailles. They called it the Flour War. Bread had climbed out of reach, crowds had seized it from the markets and set their own prices, and troops had gone out to restore order. The kingdom crowned its king with that unrest still in the air. The minister, Louis XVI, appointed to confront France's most urgent problem, its finances, was Anne Robert Jacques Turgot, an economist and administrator of real ability, who took up the post of Controller General in 1774, with a clear diagnosis and a set of reforms to match it. The treasury was strained by debts accumulated across decades of expensive warfare. The tax system was profoundly inefficient. The nobility and the clergy paid almost nothing, while the burden fell hardest on the people least able to carry it. Turgot wanted to abolish certain feudal dues, free the grain trade, and introduce a land tax applying to every property owner, regardless of rank. The resistance was immediate and organized. The nobility, the clergy, and the Parlement, the regional law courts whose members had purchased their offices and functioned as a permanent brake on royal power, pushed hard against reforms that touched their privileges. Louis, who agreed with Turgot in principle and could not hold the line in practice, dismissed him in 1776. It was the first appearance of a pattern that would repeat for the rest of the reign. Reform attempted, resistance applied, the king retreating, the problems remaining exactly where they were, while the window for solving them narrowed a little further. Her own relationship with Turgot was not warm. She found him austere, and his proposals for cutting royal expenditure personally inconvenient. This was not her finest political moment, and historians have said so fairly. But her role in his dismissal has been wildly overstated by people who wanted to blame her for everything, and quietly understated by those defending her without reservation. The likeliest truth is that she reflected the court's hostility to reform rather than creating it, a less dramatic story and a more accurate one. What Louis gave her, with evident sincerity, was the Petit Trianon. The small chateau on the estate had been built by Louis XV for Madame de Pompadour, and later used by Madame du Barry. He transferred it to his wife shortly after becoming king, telling her, in one of the genuinely warm moments of their marriage, that it was hers to do with as she pleased. He would come only when invited. She took the gift seriously. The Petit Trianon became hers in a way nothing at Versailles proper ever was, a place where she set the rules, chose the guests, and controlled, as far as anyone controls anything, her own surroundings. She had the gardens redesigned in the English manner, replacing the geometry with something looser, winding paths, irregular plantings, a small lake with grass running down to the water. She commissioned buildings for the grounds, including, later, the famous hameau. the model farm village where she and her companions could play at pastoral simplicity with the resources of the French crown standing quietly behind the performance. The spending drew comment, and it drew comment from Vienna. Her mother's letters carried increasingly pointed references to the expenditure, the gambling, the company she kept, and the continuing absence of an heir. The correspondence had settled into a sustained, affectionate pressure, an empress loving her daughter while managing her as an asset whose performance required improvement. And in the spring of 1777, Maria Theresa sent the most direct intervention available to her. She sent her son. Emperor Joseph II, her brother and her mother's co-regent, arrived in France under an assumed name, travelling as the Count of Falkenstein. In theory, a private visit. In practice, an inspection. He spent several weeks at Versailles and in Paris, observing everything, forming opinions about everything, and delivering them with a bluntness that left no room for misunderstanding. His assessments of his sister were honest to the point of cruelty. He found her charming. He loved her, and he told her, in terms she evidently took seriously, that she was squandering herself on trifles, that her political judgment was undeveloped, that her spending was corroding her reputation, and that after 7 years the absence of an heir had become a crisis. He is also believed to have spoken with the king about the physical dimension of the marriage. What passed between them has never been fully documented, but whatever it was, the long impasse ended. By the close of 1777, the marriage was consummated in every sense. By the early months of 1778, the Queen was pregnant. The news travelled fast, to Vienna, to the French public, to the whole political world that had watched this marriage with varying degrees of anxiety for the better part of a decade. The relief at Versailles was real. Her mother's reply was joyful in a way those letters rarely allowed themselves to be. On the 19th of December, 1778, she gave birth to her first child, a daughter. The girl was named Marie-Thérèse Charlotte, called Madame Royale in the formal language of the court, and she would be the only one of the Queen's children to reach adulthood. The birth itself came close to disaster. Custom held that a royal delivery was a public event, and the room filled so violently with courtiers shoving in to witness it that the heat and the crush made her faint. The king reportedly tore open the sealed windows himself to let the winter air into the room. The daughter was healthy, the Queen recovered, and for a brief season in that winter, the royal family had something it had not possessed in years: the plain, uncomplicated appearance of things going well. The Hameau de la Reine, the Queen's hamlet, went up in stages across the mid-1780s on the grounds of the Petit Trianon, and it was exactly what the name suggests: a model village. Thatched cottages around a small lake, a working dairy, a mill, a dovecote, kitchen gardens in immaculate order, and real farm animals kept in a state of exceptional cleanliness by a full staff employed precisely for that purpose. The plasterwork on the cottages was painted to look cracked and weathered, so that the buildings would appear old on the day they were finished. She and her companions could walk between the houses, gather eggs, watch the cows, and experience something in the general neighbourhood of rural simplicity, a short carriage ride from the most opulent palace in Europe, and sustained at considerable royal expense. The cows, by several accounts, were washed before she visited. That single detail is probably the most efficient summary history has produced of the distance between what the Hameau looked like and what it was. Historians still argue how much of the rest is legend, and how much was invented later by people who found the picture too useful to check. The impulse was not unprecedented. Artificial rusticity was a real 18th century fashion, rooted in the Enlightenment's idealization of nature and given intellectual respectability by Rousseau's writings on simplicity and virtue. Aristocrats across Europe were building picturesque gardens, hermitages and model farms through the 70s and 80s. She was joining a trend, not inventing one. But she was doing it at Versailles, in France, at a particular moment. and that combination turned what was elsewhere a harmless aristocratic hobby into something that read, from outside the gates, as a statement about how the crown regarded the lives of ordinary people. By the early 1780s, the Petit Trianon had become a world inside the world. She controlled who entered, and more pointedly, who did not. The relentless accessibility of Versailles proper, which required the royal family to be available at almost every hour, did not apply there. She set the guest list. She set the schedule. The people admitted were her people, the inner circle gathered slowly across the previous years, and whose composition was itself becoming a political problem. At its centre was Gabrielle de Polignac, who had entered the Queen's orbit in the early 70s and become, over a decade, her closest companion. Gabrielle was warm, undemanding, easy to love, and the affection between them was genuine. But around her had assembled her family and her connections, and those people were a great deal less disinterested than she was. Over time, the Polignac circle became a mechanism for converting royal favour into appointments, pensions and money at a rate the wider court found excessive and the public found enraging. The spending on clothes continued. Rose Bertin was still producing gowns at prices startling even by the standards of a court built on luxury. Then, in 1783, Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun, the most fashionable portraitist in France and the Queen's preferred one, painted her in a light muslin dress with her hair simply arranged, far less formal than a royal portrait had any business being. It hung at the Salon in Paris and produced a scandal of its own particular flavour. Critics said the Queen of France had been painted looking like a bourgeois woman in her mourning clothes, that it was undignified, that the muslin was practically a shift, that it was not what a monarch should be. The painting was taken down and replaced with something more conventional. It was one of those situations where nearly every choice she made was wrong in somebody's eyes. Too extravagant when she dressed elaborately, too casual when she dressed simply. And meanwhile, from the presses of Paris and from less legitimate operations further underground, a steady current of pamphlets and libelles was assembling a parallel Marie Antoinette, who bore a steadily diminishing resemblance to the actual woman. They had started circulating in the 1770s, aimed at the gambling, the spending, the Polignac favoritism. As the decade turned, they grew sharper and considerably coarser. They handed her the name Madame Déficit, tying her spending directly to the state of France's finances. They called her l'Autrichienne, the Austrian woman, leaning with obvious relish on the insult buried in the last syllables of the word. By the early 1780s, the underground presses were printing material about her that would have been actionable if written about a private citizen, let alone a queen. The difficult truth about them is that they worked. They shaped what people believed in ways the court, sealed inside its own world, neither understood nor knew how to answer. The Marie Antoinette they built, extravagant, foreign, scandalous, indifferent to the hunger of ordinary French people, was inaccurate in most of its particulars. But it was coherent, it was vivid, and it filled a space real information never reached. Almost nobody in France had direct access to her. What they knew came from what circulated, and what circulated grew steadily more hostile. In November of 1780, Maria Theresa died. She was 63, and she had reigned for 40 years, holding a dynastic empire together with a combination of political intelligence and sheer personal force that had no equal among the rulers of her generation. The news reached Versailles and struck her daughter deeply. Their relationship had been complicated. The pressure, the instructions, the constant management across hundreds of miles. It had also been a real connection, sustained through years of separation by nothing but ink and paper. The letters had continued to the end. After that November, there were no more letters from Vienna, and the thread tying her to the world she came from grew very thin. On the 22nd of October, 1781, she gave birth to a son. He was named Louis-Joseph Xavier François, and as the firstborn male child of the King of France, he became Dauphin at the moment of his first breath. The birth produced genuine celebration. The absence of a male heir had been a political vulnerability for years, and its resolution was welcomed across the whole range of French opinion, from the court down to the street pamphlets. For a short while the hostility softened. She had done what queens were for. A second son, Louis Charles, arrived on the 27th of March, 1785. A fourth child, a daughter named Sophie Hélène Béatrice, followed in July of 1786. Sophie was frail from birth and did not reach her first birthday. She died in June of 1787, the first death among her children, and a grief that was private and entirely real, in a life where very little was permitted to be either. Through all of it, the pamphlets kept circulating, the spending kept drawing criticism, the Polignac circle kept absorbing patronage, and France, out beyond the walls, kept accumulating pressures. The court's internal life gave it almost no instrument for detecting. The reputation being assembled in print, by rumour, by repetition, by the energy resentment generates once it finds a clear target, was drifting steadily away from the woman who actually existed, in a direction from which it would prove very hard to return. And then came the necklace. She had never owned it, never worn it, never ordered it, never held it. It had been designed for somebody else entirely, refused by her deliberately, then used as the instrument of a fraud she had no hand in building, none of which, in the end, mattered much. By the time the full story reached the public, the damage was already moving in a direction facts alone could not turn around. The origins reached back into the last years of the previous reign. The Parisian jewellers Baume and Bassange had spent years assembling an extraordinary piece: 647 diamonds, near 2,800 carats, in multiple strands with festoons and pendants and tassels, valued at 1,600,000 livres. It had been designed with Madame du Barry in mind as its eventual owner. Then Louis XV died, and the jewellers were left holding an object of staggering value with no obvious buyer, because almost nobody in Europe could afford it. They approached the Queen more than once. She declined. Her husband offered to buy it for her at least once, and she declined that too, saying that France had more need of ships than she had of diamonds, which was entirely true, and which also makes a better story than the historical record usually offers on her behalf. The jewellers grew desperate. The capital locked inside that necklace was threatening to ruin them. Into this walked Cardinal Louis de Rohan, Grand Almoner of France, one of the most powerful churchmen in the kingdom, and a man with a long-standing problem. Years earlier, as ambassador to Vienna, he had written letters privately mocking Maria Theresa. They were intercepted and shown to the Empress. She complained to Versailles, and the coolness that followed him home took the form of the Queen's unwavering refusal to acknowledge him at court. He had been trying to repair that ever since, and getting nowhere. Then he met Jeanne de Saint-Rémy de Valois, later the Comtesse de la Motte. Jeanne was a woman of real resourcefulness and essentially no scruples, who had constructed for herself an identity as the descendant of an illegitimate Valois line, and used that claim to work her way to the edges of court society. She presented herself to Rohan as someone with access to the Queen. The claim was entirely false. Rohan wanted it to be true badly enough that he never seriously tested it. She began producing letters, apparently from the Queen, suggesting a softening toward the cardinal and hinting that, with careful handling, his restoration might be arranged. They were forgeries, written by a man named Rétaux de Villette, who reproduced the royal hand well enough to survive Rohan's inspection. The cardinal read what he wished to read and believed it. The correspondence escalated until Jeanne arranged what she described as a short, discreet meeting with the Queen herself. At night, in the gardens of Versailles, in a grove of trees, strictly limited in length to avoid attracting notice. The woman who stepped out of the dark that night to play the Queen of France was named Nicole d'Oliva, a young Parisian who bore a passing resemblance to her, recruited for the purpose, dressed appropriately, and instructed to say almost nothing. She handed over a rose. The whole thing lasted a few minutes. Rohan, in the darkness and the emotion of the moment, did not look closely enough. He walked away, convinced he had met the Queen of France in secret, and that his long exile was ending. Historians still divide over him, whether he was purely a dupe, blinded by ambition, or whether some part of him understood how much he was choosing not to examine. Jeanne moved next. She told the cardinal that the Queen wished to acquire the diamond necklace through an intermediary, that she wanted it, but could not have the purchase publicly attached to her name, given how sensitive an enormous royal expenditure would be with France's finances under scrutiny. Rohan, by now fully committed to a fiction he had invested a great deal of hope in, agreed to be that intermediary. In January of 1785, he took delivery from Baume and Bassange, signed papers accepting responsibility for the payments, and handed the necklace to a man presented as the Queen's agent. It vanished into London and Paris, taken apart and sold stone by Jeanne and her husband, Nicolas de la Motte. The first instalment fell due in August of 1785. Nothing arrived. The jewellers, alarmed, went directly to the Queen. She had no idea what they were talking about. The fraud unravelled within days, and what her husband did next shaped everything after it. Rather than handling the matter quietly, which would have contained the damage while leaving Rohan's part unaddressed, he chose a public arrest. On the 15th of August, 1785, the Feast of the Assumption, with the entire court assembled at Versailles in ceremonial dress, Cardinal Rohan was arrested in the Hall of Mirrors. The day and the place were chosen deliberately. The king wanted it visible, on the record, impossible to misread. It backfired completely. Rohan was a prince of the church, of one of the greatest families in France, an institution in his own right. His arrest before the assembled court did not read as the crown responding decisively to fraud. It read as a question about whether a king had the right to treat a cardinal that way at all. His family mobilized, his lawyers prepared. The case went to the Parlement of Paris. The trial that ran through the spring of 1786 became one of the great public spectacles of the years before the Revolution. Every detail circulated through the city: the forged letters, the meeting in the grove, the false queen in the dark, the diamonds scattered across 2 countries. Jeanne de la Motte was convicted, sentenced to public flogging, branded and imprisoned. Her husband had already reached England. Rétaux de Villette was banished. Nicole d'Oliva, judged a naive participant rather than an architect, was acquitted, and Cardinal Rohan was acquitted as well. The public did not read that verdict as a legal finding. They read it as a political one, that the charges were insufficient, or that the crown had mishandled the whole thing from the start. For a woman entirely innocent of the fraud, the acquittal landed as something close to cruelty. What it quietly implied was that Rohan's belief in those forged letters had been reasonable, that a Marie Antoinette who held secret meetings in gardens and arranged covert purchases of diamonds was plausible enough that a sensible man might be taken in by a rough imitation of one. Jeanne eventually escaped from prison and reached London, where she spent the following years producing memoirs that placed the Queen at the centre of the entire scheme. They were widely read, believed by everyone already inclined to believe the worst, and they added to a growing body of published accusation against which she had no instrument at all. She could not sue a pamphlet. She could not publicly cross-examine a forged letter. She could only deny, and a denial issued from inside Versailles reached precisely the people least disposed to accept it. What the affair cost her was more fundamental than reputation. It cost her the benefit of the doubt. The goodwill that had greeted the births of her children, that had survived the criticism of the Polignacs and the extravagance of the wardrobe, did not survive this. The truth was too tangled to fit in a pamphlet, and too intricate for most people to follow. What lodged in memory was simpler and far more damaging. A necklace, the Queen's name fastened to it, and a verdict that seemed to say the accusation had not been unreasonable. Years later, Napoleon is said to have remarked that the Queen's death should properly be dated from the necklace trial. Historians have argued about that line ever since, but nobody disputes that something shifted in those months that never shifted back. Meanwhile, the financial situation, serious throughout the 70s and early 80s, crossed into something close to critical. France had entered the American War in 1778, supplying money and ships and troops to the colonists as a way of weakening Britain. It had worked, and it had been ruinously expensive, piled on a debt already enormous. By 1786, the Controller General, Charles Alexandre de Calonne, put the position to the king without decoration. France was spending far more than it collected. The gap was widening, and the existing structure of taxation, which exempted the nobility and clergy, the very people holding most of the country's wealth, could not be sustained without systemic reform. The proposed remedy was a universal land tax, applying to all property regardless of the owner's rank. It was not a new idea. Turgot had tried something similar a decade before, and the political problem was identical. The people who would have to pay were the people best equipped to refuse. Calonne summoned an assembly of notables in February of 1787, an advisory body of senior nobles and officials, hoping to build support before the reforms reached the Parlement. The notables declined. They raised procedural objections, questioned his arithmetic, and generally behaved as assemblies of privileged people tend to behave when invited to surrender privilege. Calonne was dismissed. His successor, Loménie de Brienne, Archbishop of Toulouse, attempted a modified version and met the identical wall. The parlements refused to register the tax edicts. The king dismissed the parlements. The parlements accused the king of despotism. And the public, who had no particular affection for the parlements either, watched two branches of the old order tear at each other, while the country's finances rotted beneath them both. Then the harvest failed. The summer of 1788 produced one of the worst harvests in living memory. A savage hailstorm in July flattened crops across wide stretches of the country, stripping fields in an afternoon. The autumn gathering was poor, and the winter that followed, from 1788 into 1789, was among the coldest of the century. A long, unbroken freeze that killed whatever had survived and made the roads impassable for weeks at a time. Whatever grain existed could not be moved, and by the first months of 1789, the price of bread in Paris consumed somewhere between 80 and 90% of a working family's daily wages. Rent, clothing, fuel, medicine, all had to come out of what remained, and what remained was almost nothing. The people living through that winter were not abstract historical forces. They were bakers and seamstresses and day labourers and market women who went to sleep hungry and woke calculating whether the day's earnings would cover the day's loaf. And in the same streets, pamphlets circulated describing a queen who had spent more on one gown than they would earn in a year. The connection people drew between the court's extravagance and their own hunger was not careful economic analysis. It was simpler than that, and far more powerful. A feeling about where the country's resources were going, and toward whom. Pushed past the point where any alternative remained, the king agreed to convene the Estates General, a representative assembly that had not met since 1614. Elections were held across France for delegates from the three estates, the clergy, the nobility, and the third estate, which meant everybody else. The process produced something extraordinary alongside the delegates: the cahiers de doléances, notebooks of grievances compiled locally, in which ordinary French people wrote down what was wrong with their lives and what they wanted changed. They remain among the most remarkable documents of the age, precisely because they were written not by politicians or philosophers, but by farmers and craftsmen and shopkeepers, describing their own circumstances in their own words. Her position through those months was complicated by public events and private grief at once. On the 4th of June, 1789, just as the Estates General was assembling and the political temperature rose by the day, the Dauphin died. Louis Joseph was 7. He had been visibly ill for months, wasting from what was understood at the time to be tuberculosis of the spine. His parents had watched him fail slowly across the preceding year, and his death, when it came, was not a surprise, and not 1 degree less painful for having been expected. Her grief was entirely real. The court's mourning was formal, and the Estates General, the newspapers, the whole political apparatus a short walk away, paused for neither. There is a small, terrible scene from those days. A delegation of the Third Estate came seeking an audience and was turned away, because the king was with his dead son. Some of the delegates took offence. A father burying a child had become a scheduling problem. The Estates General had opened on the 5th of May. Within weeks it deadlocked over a single question: whether each estate would vote as a bloc, or whether the assembly would vote by head, which would hand the far larger Third Estate an effective majority. On the 17th of June, the Third Estate, joined by sympathetic clergy and liberal nobles, declared itself the National Assembly. On the 20th, locked out of their hall, they gathered in an indoor tennis court and swore not to disperse until France had a constitution. The king's response moved between firmness and retreat in the pattern that had defined his reign. He declared the National Assembly illegal, then effectively recognised it. On the 11th of July, he dismissed his finance minister, Necker, who was popular in Paris, and the streets read it as a sign that the crown was preparing to use soldiers against the assembly. On the 14th of July, 1789, a crowd in Paris stormed the fortress of the Bastille, killed its governor, and released its handful of prisoners. The Bastille was not, at that moment, a significant prison. It held 7 inmates. But as a symbol of royal authority, it was absolute, and its fall sent a signal across France that nobody outside those walls that morning fully anticipated. That evening the king wrote in his diary. He kept it, as he always had, in the format of a hunting record, a daily notation of activity and outcome. For the 14th of July, 1789, the entry read, "Nothing." He had not hunted that day, and in the private language of that diary, a day without a hunt was a day without content. Whether he wrote it before the news came from Paris or after has been debated ever since. Either way, the same small word that had once recorded a wedding night now recorded the fall of the Bastille, and it stands in the record as a peculiarly precise measure of a man whose inner register did not match the scale of what was happening around him. She had argued for firmness from the beginning, among the voices urging her husband not to give ground. She was not wrong that yielding carried costs. She was also not right that firmness, in the conditions of 1789, had any realistic chance of working. The situation had moved beyond the instruments she understood: court politics, royal authority, diplomatic pressure. What was assembling outside the palace was not a court faction. It was something none of them inside had language for yet. The summer did not resolve the crisis. It deepened it. The National Assembly was now a functioning reality, meeting at Versailles and producing legislation at a pace that took apart the legal architecture of the old order with startling speed. In August came the August decrees, abolishing feudal privileges, ending serfdom, eliminating the tithe, sweeping away most of the legal distinctions between classes that had organized French society for centuries. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen followed. Liberty, equality, and popular sovereignty, set out in language clear enough for anyone to understand and radical enough to be genuinely dangerous to a monarchy built on the opposite premises. The king's relationship to all of this was one long reluctance. He had not summoned the Estates General to dismantle the monarchy. He had summoned it to fix a budget. What arrived instead was a transformation he neither wanted nor knew how to stop. He signed what was put in front of him under pressure, delayed what he could, and quietly wrote to foreign rulers, his Habsburg relations among them, describing his position in terms that left little doubt about what he thought of the Assembly's legitimacy. She was more direct, at least in private. Her letters from this period, especially those passing through Mercy Argenteau, make plain that she considered the Assembly's actions fundamentally illegitimate, and that she hoped for some intervention from outside France to restore the Crown's authority. It was not an achievable position in the summer of 1789. It was an honest one, and it measured the distance between where the revolution was travelling and where the royal family believed it ought to stop. In Paris, the price of bread stayed punishing. The 1789 harvest was better than the catastrophe of the year before, but better is not the same as sufficient, and whatever improvement had come in the fields had not reached the bakeries in the quantities the city needed. What the summer had given people was a language. They knew now that the Declaration of the Rights of Man existed. They knew the feudal system had been legally abolished. They knew an assembly was claiming authority over the king's decisions. They also knew that bread was still expensive, and that the royal family was still 12 miles away at Versailles, inside a palace most of them had never seen and could not begin to picture. The specific spark was a banquet. On the 1st of October 1789, a regiment was welcomed to Versailles, and a dinner held for the officers in the palace opera house. By the time the story reached Paris a few days later, the banquet had been lavish, the mood openly royalist, and at some point in the evening the tricolour cockade, the badge worn by nearly everyone in Paris who wished to signal where they stood, had been trampled or thrown aside. Whether every detail of that account was accurate matters less than the fact that by the 3rd and 4th of October, the story was running through the streets of a city already furious. On the morning of the 5th, the market women of Paris assembled and began to walk. The fishwives, the stall-holders, the women of Les Halles, the people who had been negotiating the bread shortage at the most immediate level there is. They gathered whatever came to hand as they went, pikes, pitchforks, kitchen implements, and by the time the column left the city, it numbered somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000, moving out along 12 miles of road in the rain of an October morning. They were not a military force. They were also not a formless mob. They had a destination and a purpose. Historians still debate how spontaneous it was, and whether certain figures with an interest in the Crown's humiliation helped it along. They reached Versailles in the late afternoon. The gates were shut and entirely undefendable against pressure of this kind. By evening, a delegation of women had been admitted to the king. He received them, promised bread would be released and sent to Paris, and signed the Declaration of Rights he had been putting off for weeks. The delegation went back out to the crowd with what looked, on paper, like a reasonable result. The crowd, soaked and cold, and not remotely satisfied, camped outside the walls through the night. That evening, the king discussed leaving with his advisers. Carriages were made ready. And then he decided against it. Of all the hesitations of his reign, that one, choosing to stay while leaving was still possible, may have been the most consequential. In the early hours of the 6th, a group found an unguarded way into the palace and came through. They moved along the corridors of the state apartments toward the Queen's bedchamber. 2 of her bodyguards were killed holding the door. Woken by the noise and by her attendants, she fled through a hidden passage that ran directly from her rooms to her husband's. She arrived with no shoes, in a dressing gown, just ahead of the crowd coming through behind her. What happened over the next hour was managed partly by the arrival of Lafayette and the National Guard, who placed themselves between the crowd and the family, and partly by the crowd's own shift from violence into demand. What they wanted was simple and visible: the royal family in Paris. Not 12 miles away behind gates that could be forced. In Paris, where they could be seen, and if it came to it, reached. The balcony appearance came in the morning. The king and queen stepped out above a courtyard packed with people who had, a few hours earlier, killed 2 men. At one point she came forward alone, no husband beside her, no children in front of her. She made a formal bow to the crowd and stood still. By several accounts, including hostile ones, it was a composed moment. A woman facing people prepared to harm her, choosing not to step back. Lafayette, whose position through all of this was the impossible one of a man trying to steer a revolution he had helped begin, without losing either the crown or the street, walked out and kissed her hand. It was a gesture calculated entirely for the audience below, and it worked as far as it needed to, which was far enough to get everyone through the morning without more blood. By early afternoon, they were in the carriages. The procession that left Versailles that day was unlike anything that road had carried before. The royal coaches moved slowly inside a column of National Guardsmen and the women who had marched the previous morning, and somewhere in that column, raised on pikes above the heads of the crowd, were terrible reminders of what had happened in the night. People sang as they walked. They were bringing back the baker, they said, and the baker's wife, and the baker's little boy. It took hours. The children were in the carriages. It rained the whole way. They reached the Tuileries Palace in the centre of Paris late that night. No French monarch had lived there regularly in more than 60 years, since Louis XV was a boy. The rooms were dusty, the furniture inadequate, the hastily assigned apartments a reduction from Versailles in every measurable dimension. Walking through them on arrival, the king said something to the effect that everything was very fine. A statement so far from accurate that it reads less like denial and more like what a person says when they have simply run out of language for what has happened to them. Versailles, which had stood at the centre of French royal life for nearly a century, would never house a French monarch again. The building did not vanish. It was maintained, used for assemblies, preserved. But the world it had been designed to contain ended the moment those carriages rolled out of the courtyard on the afternoon of the 6th of October. The gilded machine had run for generations on ceremony, on hierarchy, and on the quiet assumption that the space between the palace and the capital was a permanent condition, rather than a 12-mile road. The Tuileries was a palace in the architectural sense, and a prison in the practical one. It stood on the right bank of the Seine in the middle of Paris, joined to the Louvre, surrounded by gardens that were open to the public, which meant that from the day they arrived, ordinary Parisians could stroll through the grounds and observe their king and queen at a distance that would have been unthinkable at Versailles. The revolution had not abolished the spectacle of royalty. It had relocated it and changed the terms. The court had once watched her dress. Now the city watched her walk. Guardsmen stood at every exit. Any request to leave the grounds required approval. Their movements were tracked, reported, and discussed in the newspapers that had multiplied across Paris with the energy of a press suddenly released from censorship. By the end of 1789, there were well over 300 papers in the city alone, ranging from careful political analysis to publications whose entire purpose was the daily manufacture of outrage. She appeared in most of them regularly, and rarely with sympathy. The adjustment was jarring in ways that went well beyond the furniture. At Versailles, the ritual had been suffocating, but it had also been orderly. Everyone knew their place. The day followed a known sequence. The rules, however absurd, were consistent. The Tuileries had no such architecture. The household was smaller, the ceremonial stripped down, the people around them fewer and less reliable. And the sensation of being watched had changed its character entirely. From the attentive observation of courtiers into something much closer to surveillance. The king adapted the way he adapted to most things, slowly, and by locating the tasks inside it that he could actually perform. He met the assembly's ministers. He signed legislation. He attended what a constitutional monarch was required to attend. Through much of 1790, he projected a cooperation with the revolution that was not remotely sincere. He told the assembly what it needed to hear. He told his private correspondence something quite different. She was doing the same thing, and doing it with more organization. Mercy Argenteau, who had been reporting to Vienna on her behalf since she was 14 years old, remained a channel. So did Count Axel von Fersen, a Swedish nobleman who had moved through the social world of Versailles since the 70s, and whose connection to her had deepened across these years of crisis into something that clearly went beyond diplomatic courtesy. What exactly it was, historians have argued about for 2 centuries, and will probably argue about forever. The surviving letters are affectionate, heavily coded, and in places deliberately inked over by later hands. What is not in question is that he was discreet, loyal, and practically useful. He would sit at the very center of the escape that was already taking shape in those months. The content of her private correspondence was, from the revolution's point of view, precisely what its most suspicious voices suspected. She described the situation as she saw it. The family was not free. The king's cooperation was compelled rather than chosen, and the thing could only be resolved by intervention from outside. She wrote to her brother Joseph, and after his death in February of 1790, to her nephew, the Emperor Leopold II. She wrote to the King of Spain, to the Queen of Naples, to anyone whose position and resources might convert into the kind of pressure that could turn France around. None of it produced anything in the near term, and had those letters been intercepted and printed, they would have confirmed every accusation the pamphlets had ever made about the Austrian woman working against France. They were not intercepted, not yet. But they existed, and their existence measures exactly how completely she had concluded that the constitutional process was not a solution. The clearest demonstration of how deep the problem ran came with the civil constitution of the clergy, passed in July of 1790. It restructured the French Church as an organ of the state, required priests to swear loyalty to the constitution, and effectively severed the connection to Rome. To the majority of the assembly, this was simply revolutionary principle applied consistently. The church owned enormous property, exercised independent authority, and was one more institution on the list of things requiring reorganization. To the king, who was devoutly and uncomplicatedly religious, signing it created a crisis of conscience he never resolved. He signed. He took the oath required of him. He also sent private confessions to Rome expressing his anguish at having done so, and arranged, whenever he could do it undetected, to hear Mass from non-juring priests, the clergy who had refused the oath. The gap between his public compliance and his private conviction was absolute, and it produced a man whose actual political position had become nearly impossible to locate. On the 14th of July, 1790, the first anniversary of the Bastille was marked by the Festival of the Federation, an enormous public ceremony on the Champ de Mars. Hundreds of thousands attended. Lafayette organized it. Talleyrand said the open-air mass. The king stood before the assembled National Guard delegates from every corner of France and swore his oath to the Constitution in an atmosphere of genuine popular warmth. It rained heavily most of the day, and almost nobody left. For many of the people standing in that field, it was a moment of real national reconciliation. The king embracing the revolution. France going forward as one thing rather than two. She stood on the reviewing platform in the rain and watched. Shortly afterward, she wrote to Mercy that the festival had been impressive, that she and the king had been well received, and that none of it altered the underlying situation in the slightest. which she continued to describe as captivity, awaiting rescue. Then, in April of 1791, the one man who might have built a bridge between the court and the moderate wing of the Assembly died. Honoré Gabriel Riquetti, Comte de Mirabeau, had been secretly advising the royal family and quietly accepting the crown's money while maintaining his revolutionary standing in public. He was 42, the most compelling orator in France, and the most inventive thinker anyone had produced about how the two halves of the country might be reconciled. His death removed the only figure with a foot planted in each world, the one man who might conceivably have negotiated the distance between them. The Assembly mourned him in public. The court mourned him in private, for entirely different reasons. And his absence made itself felt almost at once. That same April, the family attempted to travel to the chateau of St. Cloud for Easter, a journey that would have let the king hear mass from a non-juring priest, which he could not manage in Paris. The carriages were prepared. The family came down into the courtyard of the Tuileries, and the crowd gathered outside blocked the gates and refused to let them through for the better part of 2 hours. Lafayette arrived and tried to clear a path. The crowd did not move. The family went back inside. The King of France could not leave his own courtyard. It was a demonstration clearer than anything since October of what constitutional monarchy had come to mean in practice. The protections that theoretically guaranteed his freedom existed on paper. The actual condition of his family was decided by whether the people at the gate felt like permitting something. The escape, discussed for months in letters and in low conversation, moved from theoretical to urgent. Fersen took charge of the logistics. He studied maps, arranged relay horses at post stations along the route, obtained travel documents in false names, and commissioned the carriage that would carry them from Paris to the northeastern frontier. The destination was Montmedy, near the Austrian Netherlands, where the Marquis de Bouillé commanded a force of loyal troops. Once there, the family would be under military protection, close enough to the border to be beyond the reach of Paris, and able for the first time since 1789 to negotiate from something resembling strength. The carriage he ordered was a berline, large, well-sprung, enclosed, the sort of coach a wealthy family used for a long journey in comfort. It was beautifully built. It had room for several passengers and their luggage, a compartment for food, a supply of wine, and a fitted convenience for travel. Whoever made the final decision about it had evidently concluded that comfort mattered more than speed or invisibility. A berline was not a discreet vehicle. It was the kind of coach that turned heads on provincial roads because it was obviously expensive and because it moved like something belonging to a person of consequence. Which it did, though not in a way anyone was supposed to notice. On the night of the 20th of June, 1791, they left the Tuileries in stages and in disguise. She went out dressed as a governess, walking in a plain gown and a hat through corridors she had crossed hundreds of times, stepping carefully past guards whose attention a single sound might catch. The king left separately, dressed as a valet, and took a wrong turning in the dark near the courtyard, adding several minutes of confusion to a departure already behind schedule. The children were brought out with their aunt, the king's sister, Madame Elizabeth, also in plain clothes. Fersen himself, disguised as a coachman, drove the first carriage from the meeting point near the palace. He took them through the sleeping city in the early hours and delivered them to the berliner waiting on the road beyond it. The plan required him to separate from the party before he could draw attention to it. He said goodbye somewhere out on that road, in the dark hours before dawn. He and Marie Antoinette never saw each other again. They travelled as the household of the Baroness de Korff, a fiction resting on documents obtained through diplomatic channels. She was listed as Madame Rocher, governess to the children. The king was recorded as the steward. The children were the Baroness's children, travelling with their own real governess, Madame de Tourzel, who had insisted on the right to accompany them and could not be persuaded to stay behind. It was a serviceable story for a dark road at 3 in the morning. It was not going to survive daylight and anyone who looked twice. The first problem was the clock. They should have left several hours earlier and had lost that time between one small delay and another. Bouillet's relay troops, small units of cavalry stationed at particular towns to escort the carriage through, had each been given a window in which to wait. When nothing arrived by the end of it, the commanders concluded the plan had been abandoned and pulled their men out, some of them anxious about the suspicion a body of soldiers loitering in a market square was starting to attract. So, as the berline rolled through town after town in the full light of the 21st of June, the escort that should have been there was gone. They crossed the country through the long midsummer day. Inside were a king and queen, their 2 surviving children, Madame Elisabeth and the governess, crowded together in a vehicle comfortable by any standard of the age and entirely inadequate as cover for who was actually sitting in it. The king's face was printed on the assignat, the paper currency circulating everywhere in France, which meant that any person who handled money regularly and glanced at the large man in the expensive carriage had something to compare. At Saint-Ménehould in Champagne, the postmaster who arranged the relay horses was named Jean-Baptiste Drouet. He looked at the passengers as the carriage halted. Then he looked again. He had seen that face on the currency often enough to carry a working impression of it. He said nothing. He completed the business of changing the horses, and he watched the berline roll away down the road. Then he got on a horse himself and took a faster route toward the next town of any size. Historians still argue about what actually sank the flight: the carriage that was too grand, the hours lost at the start, the escorts that gave up, or simply the accumulated weight of a plan built by people who had never in their lives had to move quickly or quietly through the world. The town ahead was Varennes. The berline rolled in around 11 at night on the 21st of June, and the town was already awake and waiting. Drouet had arrived first and told the officials what he believed he had seen, and a group of citizens had dragged a cart across the narrow bridge the carriage needed to cross. The driver stopped. The passengers were asked to identify themselves. The local procurator, a grocer named Jean-Baptiste Sauce, came out to examine the documents. Technically, the papers were in order. The faces presenting them were not quite in agreement with the story those papers told, and a former royal bodyguard who happened to be in the town that night looked at the man in the valet's coat, recognized him, and said so aloud. By midnight, they had been identified and were sitting in the rooms above the grocer's shop, while the town gathered in the street below, and the news travelled outward in every direction at once. Bouillet's cavalry were 30 miles off at Stenay when word reached them. Whatever they might have done, it was far too late for that kind of solution. Historians still turn over whether it could have gone differently in those first minutes, whether a king willing to simply order his coachman forward before the cart and the crowd and the lanterns might have driven straight through. But he was not a man who had ever done anything by simply ordering it, and he did not begin that night. Commissioners from the National Assembly, Antoine Barnave and Jérôme Pétion among them, arrived on the 22nd and took charge of the return. The journey back to Paris took 4 days along the same roads in reverse, and the difference in atmosphere between the 2 journeys was total. Enormous crowds gathered in every town they passed. They stood, for the most part, in silence, and by long custom, French subjects removed their hats in the presence of their king. All along that road, the crowds kept their hats on. Barnave rode inside the carriage for part of the way. He spoke at length with the Queen, and came away with what appears to have been real sympathy for her position, alongside a clear-eyed grasp of how much the flight had destroyed. He wrote to her privately for months afterward, trying to construct some moderate path through the wreckage. Another bridge builder, without the materials to build the bridge he could see. The political consequences settled over France within days. The pretense that the king was voluntarily cooperating with the constitutional process was finished. He had tried to leave. And the letter he left behind at the Tuileries explaining himself made perfectly clear what he thought of the revolution and everything it had imposed on him. The Assembly suspended his powers while it worked out what to do with a monarch who had attempted to abandon his kingdom. Republican voices, present but marginal before Varennes, grew considerably louder afterward. The Cordelier Club organised a petition calling for a republic. On the 17th of July, 1791, the National Guard under Lafayette fired on the crowd gathered on the Champ de Mars to sign it, killing a number of people. The same field that had held the great Festival of Reconciliation, exactly 1 year and 3 days earlier. The moderate project was attempting to hold the centre by force, and the force was making the centre steadily harder to hold. He was restored to formal power under a new and more restrictive constitution in September of 1791. He took the oath again. The Assembly declared the matter settled. Almost nobody believed it. The year that followed was one in which the ground moved faster than anyone could establish a position on it. The Legislative Assembly that replaced the National Assembly in October held a different distribution of forces. The moderate constitutionalists diminished, the Girondin and Jacobin factions far more prominent, the whole direction of travel unmistakably leftward, in a way that made the survival of a constitutional monarchy increasingly theoretical. Then the war changed everything again. France declared war on Austria in April of 1792, and the declaration was supported across most of the political spectrum for entirely incompatible reasons. Radicals wanted to carry revolutionary principles outward. Girondins believed a war would consolidate the revolution at home, and the king and queen privately hoped an Austrian army would arrive and restore them. The early months went badly. The army was disorganized, its officer corps hollowed out by emigration, the first campaigns ending in defeat or confused withdrawal. Paris read military failure as evidence of treason, and the most obvious place to look for traitors was the palace. In July of 1792, the commander of the Austrian and Prussian forces advancing toward France issued what became known as the Brunswick Manifesto, intended to shield the royal family by threatening Paris with destruction if any harm came to them. It achieved the precise opposite, with the reliability of a case study in political miscalculation. Rather than frightening the city into caution, it confirmed for a great many Parisians that their king and queen were coordinating with the armies marching on French soil. The document, written to protect them, made them infinitely more dangerous to protect. On the 10th of August, 1792, a crowd backed by the radical sections of Paris stormed the Tuileries. The Swiss guards defending it fought and were killed, several hundred of them. The family, warned the attack was coming, had already slipped out and taken refuge in the Legislative Assembly, where they sat crowded into the reporter's box, while the deputies debated what to do, and the sound of the fighting carried in through the windows. He was suspended from his functions as king that same day. Within days, the family was moved to the Temple. The Temple was a medieval tower complex in the northern part of Paris, built by the Knights Templar in the 13th century, and maintained across the intervening centuries as a fortress of genuine solidity. It was chosen precisely because it was old, thick-walled, and very difficult to leave without permission. More comfortable options existed. Comfort was no longer the point. They arrived with a reduced household, a few servants, and for a short while, Madame de Tourzel. The rooms were cramped by any standard they had ever known, and comfortable by the standard of what was coming. They were still together, which counted for something. Louis, Marie Antoinette, their daughter Marie Thérèse, their son Louis Charles, and Madame Elizabeth occupied the tower through the late summer and autumn of 1792. He was allowed books. He continued the children's lessons himself, history, geography, Latin, in a small room with the light going. They ate together. They passed the hours together in the few spaces available to them. The conditions were narrow, the watching was constant, and the outside world reached them only through the newspapers that were occasionally allowed upstairs. On the 21st of September, 1792, the monarchy was formally abolished. France was declared a republic, and the man who had been Louis XVI became, in the language of that republic, Louis Capet, a private citizen awaiting trial. The proceedings opened in December. The charges covered everything he had done through the revolution: the vetoes, the letters to foreign powers, the flight to Varennes, the 10th of August. He was allowed counsel and conducted himself with a dignity that some observers noted and others dismissed as irrelevant to an outcome already fixed. On the 20th of January, 1793, the National Convention voted. On guilt, it was very nearly unanimous. On the sentence, it was closer. 361 for death without condition, a substantial minority for imprisonment, and 72 for death with a reprieve. The conditions were not met. The reprieve did not carry. He was executed on the 21st of January at the Place de la Révolution. She learned of it from the sounds outside, and from the way her guards began to behave. She had not been permitted to see him beforehand. His last letter, written to her and to Madame Elisabeth, took days to arrive, and was not delivered while he was alive. She went into mourning in the only way the temple allowed. Black clothes in a small room, no ceremony of any kind, among children working out what had happened at the same time she was. The months between his death and her own trial were the most damaging of her imprisonment. In July of 1793, the Committee of Public Safety decided to separate her son from her. He was a small boy. The stated reason was that he required an education as a Republican citizen, away from royalist influence. He was moved to the floor below hers in the tower and placed under the supervision of a cobbler named Antoine Simon, whose task was his re-education. For a while she could hear him through the boards. She would stand where the sound came through, and then the distance grew, and that stopped too. On the 2nd of August, 1793, she was moved from the temple to the conciergerie, the prison on the Ile de la Cité that occupied part of what had been, centuries earlier, the royal palace of the Capetian kings. The Gothic towers were still there, the medieval bones still holding, though the building now served as an antechamber to the guillotine, holding those awaiting the revolutionary tribunal. Among the prisoners who passed through, it had a name: the waiting room. She spent 76 days there. The cell was small and damp and watched without interruption. A guard stationed inside the room itself, which meant no privacy at any hour of the day. Her hair, powdered white by fashion for so many years, had turned white on its own. She was 37, and by the accounts of people who saw her then, she looked considerably older. There was one last attempt to save her. A former officer, admitted by a sympathetic guard, dropped a message hidden in a carnation on the floor of her cell. She read it. The plan collapsed within days, and the only lasting effect was that her confinement tightened further. The trial opened on the 14th of October, 1793. The charges were extensive: treason, correspondence with the enemy, conspiracy against the security of France, draining the treasury. Hermann presided. Fouquier-Tinville prosecuted. Between them, they worked through a list amounting to every criticism ever published about her, gathered up and recast as indictments. It was not a proceeding designed to examine evidence. The result was understood before anybody sat down. The worst moment came when the prosecution introduced an accusation about her son, drawn from statements supposedly made by the child during his months with Simon. It was monstrous, and it was entirely fabricated. Historians have concluded with near total agreement that whatever words came out of that child were produced by adult pressure and coaching, from a child who had been taken from his mother and taught what to say. She did not answer the charge in legal terms. She turned to the women in the room and said that nature itself refuses such a thing, and that any mother present would understand why she could not reply to it. Several people in that courtroom were visibly moved, including some who had not come there on her side. It did not alter the outcome by a single vote. Guilty on all charges. The sentence was death. She was taken back to her cell that night, having been awake for the better part of 2 days. In the early hours of the 16th of October, she wrote to Madame Elizabeth, her sister-in-law, still alive then and imprisoned elsewhere. It is a calm letter, composed, clear, unhurried. She wrote to her children through it, that she hoped they would stay together and look after each other. She expressed sorrow for any pain she had caused, and she asked her daughter to forgive her brother for whatever he had been made to say. The letter was confiscated. It never reached Madame Elizabeth. It sat in the revolutionary archives for decades before it surfaced and was published, and historians still trace the odd, quiet path it took through the hands of men who chose to keep it rather than destroy it. She asked for scissors and thread to mend the black dress she meant to wear. Then she lay down on the cot in the room where a guard sat watching and waited for the light. The morning of the 16th of October 1793 began early. She was woken before dawn, dressed with what help was available, and put on white, which, in the tradition of the French royal family, was the colour of mourning. Her hair had been cut short at the nape of the neck, a practical preparation. A white cap covered the rest. The route from the conciergerie to the Place de la Révolution ran roughly 1.5 miles through the middle of Paris. The vehicle was an open cart, a tumbril, the plain wooden thing used for the condemned. Nothing enclosed, nothing between the passenger and the crowd standing along every street of the way. At Versailles, the royal family had travelled in gilded carriages through crowds held at a respectful distance. This was the same city, and an entirely different world, and the space between those two facts is the whole revolution expressed in a single journey. She sat with her hands bound behind her. The priest riding beside her was a constitutional cleric, one of those who had sworn the oath Rome had condemned. She accepted his company without being able to accept his authority, which is a small, precise piece of loneliness to carry through the last hour of a life. The cart moved at walking pace. The crowds were thick along the whole route, and their reaction was more mixed than the simplified version of this story usually allows. There were people who watched in silence, people who shouted, people who wept, and a great many who simply looked, which is its own category of response. Somewhere along the way, an artist named Jacques-Louis David sketched her from a window as the cart went past. A few rapid strokes of ink, done in seconds, that caught something exact about the set of her face. She was not weeping. She was not performing courage in any theatrical way. She sat upright, looked ahead, and endured the journey with the same composure that people at the trial had noticed and not quite known what to do with. At the scaffold, before she climbed the steps, she stepped by accident on the foot of Henri Sanson, the executioner. She turned to him and apologized. She had not done it on purpose, she said. That apology has survived in the record, partly because several people heard it and wrote it down, and partly because it is impossible to fit into any pre-existing story about who she was. It is not the gesture of a symbol. It is not the gesture of a monster, or a martyr, or a caricature in a pamphlet. Whatever else she had been, whatever else had been printed about her across 23 years, the woman who trod on somebody's foot and said sorry in that moment was simply a person. It was over by about noon on the 16th of October, 1793, in the same square that would one day be renamed for Concord. She was buried the same day in a common grave at the cemetery of the Madeleine, without ceremony and without a marker, alongside the hundreds of others the revolution had sent to the same ground. The people she left behind lived out the rest of it across the following years. Madame Elisabeth, the king's sister, who had stayed with the family through everything, was executed in May of 1794. She was 30. Louis Charles, the boy taken from his mother and handed to Antoine Simon, remained in the temple. After Simon left in January of 1794, he was increasingly alone there, and he died in June of 1795. He was 10 years old. The official cause was tuberculosis, accelerated by the conditions of his imprisonment and by the collapse of anything resembling care. What exactly happened to him in those final months is something historians have examined with great care and considerable distress. For 2 centuries afterward, people claimed to be him. Dozens of them, across Europe, insisting the boy had been smuggled out and another child substituted. The question was only settled in the year 2000, when DNA testing was carried out on a heart preserved from the autopsy and compared with a lock of his mother's hair. The child who died in that tower was her son, Marie-Thérèse Charlotte, Madame Royale, the daughter born in the crowded chaos of that December night in 1778, survived. She was released on the 18th of December, 1795, exchanged for a group of French prisoners held in Austria. She was 17. She had been imprisoned for more than 3 years and had lost her father, her mother, her brother, and her aunt inside that time. She went to Vienna. She eventually married her cousin, the Duc d'Angoulême, and lived until 1851, long enough to watch France cycle through a republic, an empire, a monarchy, another empire, and another republic, which is the kind of biography that tends to produce a very particular sort of person. By all accounts, she was not easy company. It is hard to imagine how she could have been. In January of 1815, after the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, the remains of Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI were exhumed from that common ground and carried, with full ceremony, to the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the traditional resting place of the kings of France. The state that had executed them was restoring them to their proper position in the national architecture, which says something precise about the relationship between France and its own revolution that the French have been working out ever since. What could not be reburied was the image. In the 2 centuries after her death, she became one of the most repeatedly reconsidered figures in European history. Not because the basic facts were unclear. The facts have been reasonably well established for a very long time. She was reconsidered because what those facts meant kept changing, depending entirely on who was reading them and when. To the 19th century, she was either a martyr or the perfect emblem of aristocratic excess, and which one depended almost exactly on which side of a political divide the writer happened to stand. In 1932, Stefan Zweig published a biography that took a different approach entirely. It treated her as a psychological subject, rather than a political argument, an ordinary woman set down in a position that would have required an extraordinary one. Later in the century, other historians turned the question a different way again. They looked at what her life exposed about the structural position of women in 18th century political life. A queen who held no formal office, was given no mechanism through which to influence anything, and was nonetheless held personally responsible for outcomes she had no power to decide. Blamed for a kingdom she was never permitted to govern. And then, of course, there is the cake. Let them eat cake. In the original French, let them eat brioche. It is the most famous thing she ever said, repeated across 2 centuries as the final and definitive proof of her indifference to hungry people. She never said it. The line appears in Rousseau's Confessions, written around 1765, where it is attributed vaguely to a great princess, unnamed. In 1765, Marie Antoinette was 9 years old, still running in the gardens at Schönbrunn, and had not yet set foot in France. The attachment of those words to her name seems to have grown slowly through the 19th century, fastening onto her not because anyone found evidence, but because the sentence fitted a story that had already been built. The most famous thing she ever said is the thing she never said. Among all the ironies that have gathered around her, that one is probably the most efficient summary of how history had been handling her from the beginning. The revolution that swept her away did not solve the problems that had produced it. France passed through the Terror, then the Directory, then Napoleon, then the Bourbon Restoration, then another revolution in 1830, then another in 1848, then a second empire, then a third republic, each transition carrying forward some unfinished portion of the same argument about what any of it had meant. Her death settled nothing. It was, at most, the moment when one version of France ended and another, far less certain, began. The hunger that had driven the market women out along the Versailles Road did not end on any of the dates in this story. The bread question outlived every person who ever tried to answer it. What she left behind was not a political legacy in any ordinary sense. She never governed. She never held formal power. She never made the decisions that shaped the kingdom she nominally helped to rule. What she left was something looser and, in its way, more durable. An image, reproduced and reconsidered without end, of a woman placed at the centre of an enormous event she did not fully understand, carrying the weight of everything other people needed her to represent. And underneath the representation, the person is still there, stubbornly, quietly present in the documents, in the letters to her mother, with their wandering spelling that never entirely improved, in the quick ink sketch made from a window, in the trial transcript, in the apology to a man whose foot she had stepped on, offered out of pure reflex, at the last possible moment when reflexes still mattered. She is easy to find, in the end. She only ever required somebody to take the time to look. So the story rests here. Not a villain, not a saint. A person shaped by forces enormously larger than herself, living inside a world that was ending, inside a revolution that no single human being could have stopped. The carriages have long since gone quiet. Think of everything that has settled since. The pavilion on the river island was taken apart not long after she passed through it. There is nothing on that ground now but grass and water, moving slowly toward the sea. The little pug she was not allowed to bring lived out its ordinary life somewhere in Vienna, and was forgotten by everyone except, perhaps, by her. The flower that whitened all those towering heads went back to being bread. The cottages of the Hameau still stand at the edge of their small lake, their plaster still painted to look older than it is, and the cows are gone, and no one washes anything before a visitor arrives. Versailles is still there. You can walk through the Hall of Mirrors on an ordinary afternoon, and the same 17 windows still throw the same gardens back into the room, and the light moves across that floor exactly the way it did when a 14-year-old girl came in from Austria and had to learn how to cross it. The Place de la Concorde is busy with traffic most mornings. People cross it without looking up, on their way to work, thinking about ordinary things. And in the cool stone quiet of Saint-Denis, among the kings and queens of France, the girl who once crossed a river and left behind her language, her clothes, her attendants and her small dog is finally, permanently still. No audience, no ceremony to perform, no one watching her sleep. That is where we leave her tonight. You can let the rest of it go now. The pamphlets, the diamonds, the winter roads, the candle burning in a window until somebody put it out. It has all already happened. It happened a long time ago, and none of it is asking anything of you tonight. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let your jaw loosen. Let your hands rest wherever they have come to rest. Somewhere out there, someone in Melbourne is listening at 2 a.m, and someone in Toronto is listening just past midnight, and all of you are drifting towards sleep inside the same quiet story. Breathe out slowly. There is nothing left to follow. There is nothing left to remember. The history will still be here when you wake, patient and unhurried, exactly where you left it. Close your eyes. Rest now.